Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast, powered by ISOFIT and Firefly Recovery. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training. For more on ISOFIT, be sure to check out isofit.com. Episodes like this are made possible by Firefly, the official recovery provider of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. For more on Firefly, be sure to check out recoveryfirefly.com. This episode is powered by Dr. Ray Gorman, founder of Engage Movement. Learn how to boost your income without relying on sessions. Get a free training on the blended practice model by following at Ray Gorman DPT on Instagram. Danny, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. As we were just talking about, you are an absolute legend in the space, especially around isometrics. That way, you are one of the leading experts that I like to go to, especially for your research contributions and your writings, man. It's so great to connect with you. For anyone who hasn't maybe heard about you and all the amazing work you do in Singapore, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are and how you've kind of gotten into this world of researching isometrics and beyond?
Hi, thanks Daniel for the invitation. I'm Danny. I'm from High Performance Sport Institute of Singapore. We used to be called Singapore Sport Institute. We recently just changed the name. I'm a senior strength conditioning scientist down here. I started my journey on isometric training back in 2017, 2018 when I did my PhD. It actually stems from me working with our judo athletes. I had one judo athlete who was so big. He was like 200 over kilogram, and he wasn't very good with his motor skill apart from his judo stuff. And we had pretty limited time to get him strong enough for the Southeast Asian Games. So I started looking at different ways to train, and isometric came along. Because I don't really need him to be proficient in motor control stuff. I can just get him to push against a bar, and that was it. From then on, I went on to use isometric training with our swimmers, and it worked pretty well. And so I started my research on isometric training for high performance sports because back then there were very little on it, very little studies conducted on high performance, the effects of high performance with isometric training. And that was how it all came about. And so that's how we have all the isometric research coming from Singapore.
I think the effect of work from individuals such as yourself is very well seen that way. I feel like anytime I open up Instagram or Facebook or TikTok, I'm seeing more people training isometrics and more people talking about training isometrics and how to implement that into their framework that way. And I personally absolutely love to see that. As we were talking about earlier, isometrics are a big part of my work as a physical therapist, and I use them throughout rehab processes, whether that's early on or in the later stages that way. But I think ultimately what makes you successful with isometrics is having a robust understanding of the types of isometrics that you can do, when to call on each, and again, putting the pieces of the puzzle together, if you will, having a system or a framework to go off of instead of just kind of picking one that you like and throwing it in and hoping for the best. There is a actual knowledge base and understanding that goes into this whole thing. I know this concept of training without moving sounds simple, but I've found it's a lot more complex than I think we often give it credit for that way. So first off, Danny, what's been your overall framework for kind of bucketing or, systematizing isometric training that way? Where do you kind of put in your overcoming, yielding, EQIs, functional isos, isometronics, all the different types of isometric type training that we have right now? How do you go about kind of organizing that in your mind that way for training and strength and conditioning purposes?
Okay. I like to keep things very simple. So when it comes to categorizing isometric, we actually recently came up with a review paper which is still on under review. The two types of isometric is the push isometric and the hold isometric. Push isometric is what is also commonly known as the overcoming, and hold isometric is the yielding isometric that is known to practitioners. And I keep things simple. I just categorize them into push and hold. And other than that, I look at isometric training, the adaptations to isometric training. The principles of adaptation is pretty similar to how it works for dynamic training, right? So if you want to you want to get muscle hypertrophy, and then that's related to volume of training. You want to get increase in maximal strength, then it depends on the intensity of your contraction. And if you want to increase rate of force development, then we just have to contract rapidly. So from then on, that's when I start to plan my training, right? And between push and hold, what we found was that hold isometric tend to increase hypertrophy more um, with a given intensity and volume of work, while the push isometric seems to be better at increasing the neuromuscular strength. So in that case, when the objective is more towards hypertrophy, um, then we'll add in more of the whole isometric. And if we're looking at rate of force development, we're looking at maximal strength, then the push isometric comes to play. And then volume of work, um, intensity, it all depends on the objective at that point of time, right? In general, what is good about isometric is that it's less fatiguing, it poses less risk of injury than dynamic training. And you can basically repeatedly exert maximal voluntary contraction uh, within a single session. Unlike dynamic, you can't possibly get a person to do a 1 hour M intensity for multiple sets. That's the advantage of isometric. And so because of that, can replace some sets of dynamic with isometric, just so that you don't have to over fatigue your athlete while you can still get them to uh, work at a very high intensity. It works very well for rehab setting as well because low risk of injury can get the athletes to contract as hard as they can and still control it because the moment they feel the pain, they know where to stop. Yeah, so that's I hope that answers the question. Or
For
yeah,
sure. That was
yeah.
great, Danny. I mean, it sounds like you look at things, as you mentioned, a very simple framework is what you're looking for. I like your breakdown of overcoming versus yielding, right? You're either pushing or pulling on something, or you're holding and resisting the effects of gravity. It's one of the two, right? And all those other
Hmm.
many types of isometrics that people throw out there, right? Like your EQIs, your functional isometrics, they all have a component of them that I would lump
Mm.
under the overcoming or yielding element, right? Something like an EQI, I bias that more towards the yielding. Something like a functional isometric, I bias that more towards the overcoming, right? Ballistic, I
Hmm.
consider that as a type of overcoming that way. So it's understanding, first off, what are the big rocks in this metaphorical jar, and then what are the other little grains of sand that way. And I think a lot of it, again, like a lot of the isometric work I do with the athletes that I work with, I would say 80 to 90% of it, maybe even up to 95%, depending on the day and the week, is either overcoming or yielding. It's one of the two. Again, it's very, very simple. It's very, very straightforward, but it drives a lot of good outcomes. But again, you have to know when to call on things. And you mentioned about the PIMA type contractions being better for neuromuscular strength. And I think
Mm.
that's one of the most overlooked things, or maybe it's just me that overlooked it. But I came out of school thinking it's all about building bigger muscles, right? Because larger muscles contract with more force and then we're
Mm.
good to go. But sometimes it's not just about the horsepower that's in the car. Sometimes it's about the skill of the driver driving the car that way. And it's a matter of how do we make that car run more effectively, more efficiently, and teach that driver how to actually operate that machine, right?
Hmm.
And I think, a lot of times we've done so good with athletes building up a lot of horsepower, but they don't necessarily feel themselves being in tune with it, or they don't know how to sequence it or put all the pieces together of it, right? You mentioned that in relation to the athlete that you were working with early on that way. The judo athlete was, you had a limited time frame, and he sounds like you're someone who, from what you mentioned and what you shared, didn't necessarily have the best motor planning strategies. So it's like, hey, how do we improve this specific thing in a short amount of time? We're going to go in the thing that drives the most neuromuscular intent that way. And I think in general, a lot of us, again, maybe I'm just speaking about myself, have really overlooked the role of the neurological side of movement. And we've maybe focused a little too much on the, hypertrophy side alone that way, if you will.
So, if you look at a number of studies, they have actually shown that at least for the early stage, when the increase in strength and the change in muscle size don't really correlate that much. But of course, down the road in the long term, development wise, we do want that hypertrophy because the bigger your muscles are, the potential to increase strength will be higher as well. Yeah. And I do tend to look at training when training for strength. Sometimes I categorize it into am I training the muscle cells and or am I training the nervous system, right? If I'm looking at increasing muscular power, maximal strength, then gears more towards uh, the neural side of things because we already have so for example like a tug of war, right? You have your muscles are like the number of teammates you have, right? You can have 10 teammates in your team, but if they can't synchronize the pull together, then the other team with a lower number of teammates, they might be able to win because the, each time they exert the force, it's synchronized. So that's when that's probably one of the reasons why um, even though you increase your muscle hypertrophy, you don't get that same amount, magnitude of increment in strength.
Absolutely. And as you mentioned, it's not to overlook the role of muscular hypertrophy at all. It's just a matter of understanding what things have we maybe been missing in
Mm.
our own training
Yep.
programs that way, and where can we kind of fill in those gaps and bridge those gaps that way. And I think the other piece that I find interesting that you brought up was having that kind of like separate bucket for rate of force development that way, right? You mentioned hypertrophy, mentioned strength, and then you have that RFD category as well under your kind of considerations for isometrics. And it's interesting because just this morning, I was on a call with someone from a D1 university here in the US, and they were talking about how they literally use the DSI to, dictate their programming with the athletes that they do that way. They do the
Mm.
iso squat, the counter movement jump, they look at the force numbers, and then they're pushing their athletes towards hey, do we need to do more of a like RFD type of programming, or do we need to do more of a stretch shortening cycle emphasis type of programming that way? And I think having that understanding of, again, what interventions what exercises you're going to reach for based on how you profile your athletes and overall the considerations that go into the isometric test itself to understand where the athlete falls from a profile standpoint is absolutely essential. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I know you've done a number of great research articles and studies in relation to isometric testing that way. I've seen,
Mm.
the thigh pull and the first pull and different things that way. What's kind of become your own little isometric testing assessment battery, if you will, that way? And what kind of tests do you see as having, great bang for your buck, right? We get a lot of good information off performing certain isometric tests. And what isometric tests do you feel are maybe nice if you have the time, but maybe not quite as essential as some of the others that way?
Okay. In down here, we have a standard num fixed test protocols that we use to test our assess the strength of our athletes. Mainly, isometric mid-thigh pull being the staple test to go to. We tend to look at peak force and as well as force at 100 milliseconds because that's like the measurement for the how explosive they are. Recently, we also looked at we did a study on isometric squat, and we used the isometric squat to peak force to predict 1 RM. It's not too bad. The margin of error on average is quite low. If you want to use isometric test to predict 1 RM of isometric squat. Sorry, 1 RM of your dynamic squat. You can have a look at our research study. So what we actually found was that in consistent with many other research, right, on isometric tests and correlation between isometric test and dynamic performance was that if you want to get a higher correlation, then the position where the isometric test is conducted is performed has to be very close to uh, the position where concentric force is initiated for that dynamic movement. So, for example, during our study on the isometric squat, what we found was that uh, at isometric squat at the parallel position, at the thigh parallel to the ground position, has the highest correlation to the 1 RM squat. So, because that is where the concentric phase occur. But of course, if we want to have a high accuracy of prediction, what we did was we used the peak force from 3 different positions, so parallel, 90-degree, and 120-degree, to predict that 1 RM squat. And generally, there for isometric tests, you have other metrics like early force development, rate of force development, impulse, and so on. We tend to look only at peak force and early force development for our monitoring our athletes, basically because it's more reliable. Results are more reliable. Rate of force development is tend to be unreliable because it's force time dependent. Right? You have to divide the force by time and so on. So that become a lot more variable. When we perform peak force, we want to get the peak force. The better protocol is actually to get the athlete to just pull as hard as possible, not concerning whether they are pulling it explosively, because that way they can actually have a greater amount of time to develop the force. And we're looking at early force development, or some who are interested in looking at rate of force development as well. What I recommend is to have a standardized pretension, because if the pretension is not standardized, you tend to see a lot of fluctuation in the results you get, basically because all this are time dependent. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, that makes so much sense the way you outlined that. And I like how in relation to the isometric squat, you mentioned in your study you looked at 3 different positions instead of just one. And I think it's essential to note like it's not as simple as just testing one position and having the keys to the universe. Sometimes you have to dive in a little bit
Mm.
deeper and look at things a little bit more holistically that way. I also like your point on RFD and the time dependent component of it. One of the things I've noticed while just using a handheld dynamometer in the clinic is just how wildly we can see RFD values vary from one set to the next, right? Like I'm seeing 50 to 100% fluctuations
Mm.
sometimes from one set to the next. And, there's a whole cascade of variables that can impact that, from your rest time to even one of the most powerful things I've seen is just the language and cueing you use around an isometric test. And I think just like the actual setup and protocol for the test itself has to be standardized, the language and wording you use for the test itself should also be standardized to a certain extent as well, because some of those different like additional cues that I've given in the past, or if I start to like hype someone up from a motivational standpoint a little bit, they exert significantly more force. And I don't have any research backed number on this, but just clinically, I've seen the number jump up 20, 30%, if not more, on isometric tests, just depending on how I cue it and
Yep.
depending on, what kind of encouragement we give to the athlete that way. So I think it becomes a question of, how do you want to deliver it yourself? And everyone's going to deliver it a little bit differently. Not everyone's going to cue it the exact same, and that's okay. But I think you just need to be consistent within your own delivery of that to the athletes that you work with so they get the same thing every time Otherwise, you're going to be looking at the graphs and charts and seeing these wild isometric testing fluctuations and can't make heads or tails of it, right? It's just a
Yeah,
matter of having a very systematized process, in my opinion, for isometric testing.
yeah. Yeah, it goes the same for every other test. Yeah. Instructions and keeping everything standardized just so that we can have a reliable uh, uh results.
Absolutely. And as we've kind of walked through this process so far, we went over some of the different types of isometrics and how you think about them as either PIMA or HEMA in nature. We also just touched on the testing element and assessing, where's my athlete going to fall on the spectrum here? What kind of things do I want to intervene with them at? And I think once you've got an understanding of the knowledge and framework of isometrics, once you've gotten some kind of testing and assessment of some sort on the athlete, and obviously isometrics are not the only thing here. There's plenty of other great dynamic assessments and
Hmm.
things that you can do for your athlete. But when it comes to apply things, this is where I think you in particular have this amazing gift of putting pieces together that way. I've seen some of your different superset pairings on isometrics with plyometric or ballistic type movement patterns, like throwing objects or jumping that way. And I think that
Mm.
there's something powerful about understanding how to put the pieces together from an application standpoint that way. So when it comes to fitting isometrics into your overall programming that way, what's kind of been your own framework for putting the pieces together from a programming standpoint? Do isometrics appear early on? Do they appear later in your sessions? Are isometrics scattered throughout the session? Do you follow a microdosing model? What's kind of your own thoughts around programming isometrics, and what kind of other variability have you seen in relation to that you've really liked?
So I go to the microdosing part first. Yes, I do get the athletes to microdose on isometrics, so especially the hamstring for my track athletes. So what I have advised is that instead of just doing the static stretch, they get into the hamstring stretch position and just do isometric hip extension. Right. So they get you know how we do the PNF stretch for the hamstring? Yeah. So just do that instead of static stretch. Uh you you get your strength increment, you get your range of movement as well. So that is how I get them to microdose on isometric. And generally I just get them to do maybe 2 reps of 10 seconds um as part of the warm up every session for their track. And when it comes to a training session, isometric is generally quite scattered all around for the training. Again, it all depends on the objective of that mesocycle. Sometimes I have isometric for um, the whole session. Sometimes I have isometric for maybe just one particular body part. So, for example, with my track athletes as well, again, isometric is always performed for the Achilles, the ankle joint, right? So I always get them to do either isometric half push or I get them to do an isometric step up with just the forefoot in contact with the platform. Then loading wise, generally 100% bond maximum voluntary contraction and holding for 10 seconds or so within a set. 10 yeah, within a set they will be holding for a total of 10 seconds. So it can be a configuration of one repetition of 10 seconds or 5 repetitions of 2 seconds. So if my concern at that point in time is just maximal strength and strengthening the tendon, then it's one continuous 10 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds sometimes. Um, if at that point in time rate of force development is the concern, it would be 2 seconds rapid contraction, 2 seconds rapid contraction, because there is an interference effect if you have and the element of explosiveness and endurance. So if your focus is on rate of force development, you want to make sure that you minimize the element of endurance, at least within that training session. Otherwise, there will be an interference effect. You don't get as much improvement in rate of force development as you want. For the whole isometric, I tend to use it during the earlier phases. Um, like I said, when my concern is more towards hypertrophy, and at that point in time, we are working more at sub-maximal level. I'll add in the whole isometric. But of course, if you look at Alex Natero's work, he does have this concept of um, the isometric isometric catch. So it's like a very rapid uh drop, and then you need to hold as fast as possible. Sort of like performing a drop landing, but you land stiffly. Yeah. So you want to get into the isometric state as quick as possible. That is something I do add in towards the later phase of training as well. Because you need to resist a certain amount of force within a very short period of time. So that works on the rate of force development as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. You outlined so many great points there. And just to kind of build off of them a little bit, you mentioned in relation to kind of those parts where isometric training fits into parts of your session and it's not the entire session, that you're usually doing sets of about 10 seconds with 100% MVC that way. And sometimes you break it up into multiple sets of shorter durations, like 2 or 3 seconds, looking to accumulate about a 10-second total volume or total duration of isometric time that way. It sounds like for you, depending on what adaptation you're trying to drive, it sounds like 10 seconds with 100% MVC is kind of your minimum effective dose if your intent is to drive something more along the lines of maximal strength or maximal intensity. Is that correct?
Yeah, more or less that way. It also because when all right, if I'm looking at hypertrophy, I want to accumulate a longer period of tension
Right.
within a single repetition. Yeah, so I thought 10 seconds is good because if I'm working at 100% MVC, most people probably won't be able to hold 100% for more than 10 seconds, right? Some, especially the more power type, explosive type of athlete, you see the force dropping right after 5 seconds. But of course, with endurance athlete, some of them can hold as long as 20 seconds. Yeah, so we do in this case we do really have to look at the individual profile of athletes. But in general, I tend to work with the power type athletes, and that's why 10 seconds is what I usually recommend.
Quick break because if you're a rehab professional sick of burnout, this could be your answer. Engage Movement's blended practice model is a proven system built by Dr. Ray Gorman, a PT who walked away from the 55-hour-a-week grind and built a blended practice model that doubled his income while working less than 25 hours a week, and he didn't have to rely on the traditional way of selling sessions to do so. It's all about blending remote and in-person services, stacking monthly recurring revenue, and building a business that finally supports your life, not the other way around. This model isn't just theory. Real providers, including myself, are creating lives of freedom and flexibility without being tied to their schedule. And as a listener, you get free access to the complete training. DM my name, Dan, to @RayGormanDPT on Instagram and receive your free breakdown on the model. Absolutely. I love that. And it's, again, it's a great piece to the puzzle that way. And I think knowing what that end goal is. So if your end goal is we need to get 10 seconds of volume, as you alluded to, there's so many different ways to get there. If you can't hold it for 10
Mhm.
seconds, hey, hold it for 2 seconds, we'll rest and then we'll come back to it. And I think it's important to note that it's okay to rest during these sessions if your goal is maximum intensity, right? If they can't hold
Mhm.
maximum intensity and they dip down to 70% max force output, there's no, if your goal is max intensity contraction and you're not getting that, don't continue to push, right?
Yep.
Give them a break, let them recover, and then go at it again. It's all about keeping the main thing at the end of the day. You also
Yeah.
brought up the isometric catch, which I'm also a huge fan of that way. but kind of like you, it takes time to progress someone to that point. It's not something I jump right to day one or week one in a rehab process that way. It's more what I would
Hmm.
consider, your mid or late stage kind of process that way. What kind of things, what kind of boxes do you look to check before you implement ISO catches with the athletes that you work with that way? And then how do you go about progressing those ISO catches over time that way? If you're using like a bar, are you just adding more weight on the bar, or is there other means of progressing the isometric catch and progressing to the point where you're programming isometric catches for the athletes that you work with?
First of all, definitely pain-free, because isometric catch is a very fast action, right? Definitely pain-free, non-injured athletes. In terms of progression, it really depends on individual. Um, you know how I can get them to do just how we do a snap down squat. Yeah. So that is a that is an example of a low intensity iso catch, right? And then I think individually you just have to look at whether they are proficient with the landing mechanics. As long as they're proficient with the landing mechanics, there wouldn't be a problem with them doing iso catch. And say if I'm trying to do iso catch using drop jump, what I can start with is looking at their counter movement jump height. So say this person can jump 30 cm. I start doing the drop landing with stiff landing, starting from 30 cm, or plus minus 10% of that. So I think that is a good benchmark to start with. Yeah. And then can slowly increase the drop height and so on. Yeah.
Absolutely. And then you can add in several other variables as well, right? Going back
Hmm.
to the snap down example that you gave, by no means do I think the snap down is the end all be all of interventions here, but I think people overlook it and overlook
Mm.
how creative you can get with it, right? One of the many things I like to do with it is actually give the athlete a medicine ball or some type of weight implement, and as they snap down, move that in a certain direction. And I tend to predefine that direction ahead of time, like, hey, I want you to move it here, or I want you to move it here. And what that's doing is I'm introducing a rotational element to the exercise. So it's not just, hey, can you stabilize quickly, getting to that isometric state quickly from a strictly sagittal plane. It's, hey, can I introduce forces in other planes of motion and you still get to that stability element? And sometimes I'll even
Hmm.
use it from an assessment standpoint, right? It's, hey, can I create a force? I don't personally care how much that force is. I'm not going to measure every single thing here, but can I create a force in a new plane of motion, whether that be biasing, hip internal rotation or external rotation that way? And are you still able to stabilize quickly? What does that stability element look like? If there is any kind of compensation strategy, where is it coming from? Is the foot and ankle complex shifting into a position I don't like? Is the knee shifting into a position I don't like? And I think that the ISO catch and some of these different implements can be so, so powerful if you just open your mind and get a little bit creative with them, right? You can
Yeah.
really, the sky's the limit that way. It's just a matter of, understanding what it's trying to do and how you can introduce variability and chaos within it. And then off of that as well, I also really like the work that you've done on isometric supersets. And I think you might have had a post with Sportsmith about that earlier as well that way. And I think, again, knowing where isometrics fit into the framework is really, the secret sauce here that way.
Mm.
What do you like to do from a programming standpoint for supersets, upper body versus lower body? What kind of combinations have you come up with? And what's kind of your overall exercise prescription as far as intensity and volume goes for, pairing something like a plyometric with something like a max effort PIMA, if you will?
Okay. All right. So, two reasons why I do contrast training, ISO and plyometric training is, firstly, we go to some research showing that plyometric being uh, very effective in improving the active muscle stiffness. So that is important because during a fast, rapid stretch shortening cycle, what happened is the muscle get into a relatively isometric state, and then that's when the muscle hold itself steadily so that the tendon can be stretched. All right, we want the tendon to be stretched so that when it recoils, we get that uh, fast explosive force. Right. So plyometric does that, but plyometric isn't so good at improving the tendon stiffness. Why we want stiff tendon again is because if you can stretch a tendon, especially a stiff tendon, then you get a greater recoil. All right. So we need another form of mode of training. Tendon respond well to slow contraction, slow but high intensity contraction. All right. So in theory, as eccentric, any form of resistance training should work as long as you can load uh the the muscular tendon stiffness at high intensity. So that's when isometric works well because, as mentioned earlier, you can repeatedly perform maximum voluntary contraction. So in that case, you can repeatedly produce high and slow strain to the tendon within a single session. That will help the tendon to get stiffer. All right. And because one improved the tendon stiffness and then one improved the active muscle stiffness, then if I combine it together, that should help me to improve my force development very well, especially for those rapid stretch shortening cycle action. And that is the reason why I tend to recommend um, contrast training using isometric and plyometric. And recently I did post on my Instagram on a study that actually showed that contrast training with isometric and plyometric resulted in greater neuromuscular adaptation than when they did a contrast training with dynamic and plyometric. So heavy resistance and plyometric. Yeah.
I think it makes a lot of sense, right? You know, when you're not moving, you're able to produce extremely high force output that way. So you're getting very opposite ends of the force velocity
Yeah.
spectrum that
Yeah.
way. Would you mind giving a few examples of kind of some of the pairings that you like to do from an ISO and plyo superset combo here? And what's kind of the exercise prescription parameters that you like to follow from that, the overall volumes, intensities,
Okay.
and so on that way?
Examples of exercise. So very simple ones are like I do the isometric step up and my step for my track athlete, my step up height is only about 15 to 15 centimeters platform. So the knee they keep a floating heel. So this the platform, this the foot. They'll have a floating heel. And I'll get them to do that. Um, and the knee angle will be about maybe 120, 140, 150-degree knee angle. So it's like they're trying to perform a step up. The main objective is to because when you're running, your hip and knee, sorry, your glute and quad muscle will be able to produce a high amount of force, but if your ankle joint cannot hold it, then you are losing all the force will be leaking. So the objective is to make sure that the ankle is able to maintain stiffness, right? So I use isometric on that, and then I'll pair it with maybe single leg hop, single leg bounding, um, and Alex has this isometric hip extension. So it's like a hip thrust, but with a more straightened, more extended knee. So you work a lot more on the hamstring as well. So I do isometric with that, and then I pair it with the dynamic version of it. So it's like you get to switch. Yeah. Um, or I can get my athlete to perform a short sprint after that just to get dynamic hamstring contraction. Yeah. The pairing of the isometric and plyometric is generally um the action. that is but mechanically quite similar. So, for example, I do isometric split squat. I can pair it with a split jump. I do isometric squat. I can pair it with a counter movement jump or a standing broad jump.
It sounds like you keep, as you mentioned before, you keep things very simple, in particular with the plyometric component as well. This is another area, just like isometrics.
Mhm.
This could be a bit of a rabbit hole if we let it be, but I think a lot of people get lost here and they get so caught up in all these different crazy advanced plyo interventions that they can do that way. And, I think at the end of the day, if you do the simple things really well, right? If you're building repeat volume sprint contacts, with intent. If you're having your athletes jump, bound, and hop in a variety of different patterns at a variety of different angles, then you're checking the majority of the boxes that you need to. I don't think
Yeah.
you have to get overly complicated with the work that you do from a plyometric standpoint or an isometric standpoint. I think a lot of times, to your point, the simpler you can make it, the better off you're going to be that way. And obviously,
Mm.
a lot of the work that you've, highlighted so far has been very compound in nature, with the exception of hip extension, which I mean, there's so much great work about the importance of isolating hip extension and how
Yeah.
athletes are struggling to get that hip extension, or going back to that neurological component for a minute. The amount of athletes that I've worked with that can extend their hips, and I'll probably get some hate for this, but they don't ever really feel any kind of glute engagement. And I'm not saying their glutes are not working, they just never feel it there.
Hmm.
And then we actually kind of get them to feel a isolated glute contraction and then go into something that involves hip extension, right? Maybe it's something like a sled push, for example. And there's like this light bulb moment that a lot of them look at me with, where it's like, oh, so that's what it's supposed to feel like. And it's like, yes, like you're supposed to feel these muscles work. And again, I'm not saying that they went to sleep. I'm not saying that they weren't doing any work before that way, but it's just understanding the importance of so many of these things, but also understanding that you check off so many boxes with the
Yeah.
compounds. You check off so much with the general plyos that we just outlined. You check off so much with some of the different compound ISOs that you outlined, whether that be the ISO push up, the ISO step up, and so on that way. And obviously, when you do need to get more specific on things that your athletes struggle with, like the hip extension, there's isometric setups that you can just crush that with open chain, closed chain, whatever you want to do that way. I think it's great.
Yeah. Yeah. I tend to keep things simple because we need to understand that our job is to improve the physical capacity of our athlete, right? We're not trying to turn them into Cirque du Soleil, circus acrobats, and so on. You get what I mean? They have what we need to do is basically improve the physical capacity, and that is and then we have to make sure that, of course, during their sports training, they improve on their technical side of things. We're not trying to improve them to be fantastic um weightlifting athlete. Not not the weightlifter, but weight it's like resistance training athlete, right? Those are different, really, really different things. We're not trying to increase their motor ability in on the weights in the weights room, right? In the weights room, we're trying to improve their overall physical capacity, and they need to perform well on the field. That's what we need to do. Yeah. So um, um, I don't see the need to get things too fanciful in the weight room. You know, keep things simple and basic.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree with you that way. And one of the other things you brought up was the role of the tendon that way. And I mean, there's so many different tendons within the human body that way. And I think the majority of the time we overlook a lot of them, right? Like at least for myself personally, I tend to bias myself towards, Achilles tendon, patellar tendon, pec
Mm.
tendon, rotator cuff tendons, bicep tendons, tendons that tend to come up a lot from a clinical practice, but there's so many other tendinous structures that way that we also need to train that way that can have a huge impact and influence on our performance and our outcomes and overall the health and longevity of the athlete that way. And obviously, you brought up the tendon stiffness component that way. And I think one of the other many things that I've used isometrics for is to address some of the different tendinopathies that come up, in
Mm.
relation to athletes just playing their sport. Basketball is probably the first one to come to mind for me that way. The amount of different little Achilles flare-ups and patellar tendon flare-ups I've seen, and I've seen isometrics be an incredibly powerful stimulus for that population. And again, there's plenty of other options, right? Eccentrics also offer a great stimulus
Hmm.
for the tendon, don't get me wrong, but to the point that you made about keeping the main thing, right? My goal is to get them back to sport quickly and safely. And, I've seen the most bang for my buck from going with isometrics for that, right? The pain levels drop. There's just not as much of a fear component associated with it. And I attribute some of that to the fact that they're not even moving. I think a lot of times people look at the isometrics and they're like, oh, that's it. I can do that. No problem. And then, of course, they do it and you get that crazy shaking effect that way.
Yeah.
It's great to see. But what other, outside of improved tendon stiffness through the pairing that you get between the isometric and the plyo, are there any other tendinous type adaptations that you see coming from isometrics that way? And are there any other key roles that the tendon plays from a performance and just overall injury mitigation standpoint?
Yeah, tendon has been shown. We're doing a review on review study on this, but what we have shown is people tend to look at just the muscle because that's the beautiful thing when you strike a pose. You don't really see the tendon, but tendon is actually the very important tissue that actually transmit the force from the muscle. And so if you have a strong tendon, uh, your rate of force development will improve. Your risk of injury will decrease as well. Um, One of the hypotheses I have with our athlete is that because I see a lot of senior athletes, as in those that are old, grown adults athletes, tend to have a lot of tendon injury. One reason I hypothesize is that when they were young, um, Singapore being a more conservative country, many people have a lot of misconception of what heavy strength training can do. Um, so when our athletes, at least for those uh the earlier generation ones, they tend to have a lot of tendon injury because when they're young, they do a lot of ballistic activity, plyometric running, jumpings, and stuff like that. But there is a lack of resistance training, right? And so there is an imbalance in the development of the muscle and the tendon. And when you're young, you recover fast, you have high collagen turnover, not an issue, right? But once we get older, we start to collagen turnover tend to slow down, and we don't recover as well. So with the imbalance between the strength of the muscle and the tendon, um, they start getting a lot of tendon injury, and so that's why I believe that right from a young age, athletes should start doing resistance training to work on tendon strength as well.
Love that point. That's really well put, Danny. And I also want to just pick on real quick. I mentioned the shaking component that we tend to see a lot in relation to isometrics that way, especially
Mm,
your longer duration HEMAs that way. And one of the many questions I get asked is, what is that and what causes that shaking response that way? And I've got a couple theories, but I haven't necessarily found a way to prove anything
yeah.
yet. What is your thought behind why we get that kind of muscular shaking response, in relation to some of these max intent isometrics or some of these long duration HEMAs that way.
Okay. I haven't tested it out yet, and I don't have the expertise to test it. What I hypothesize is because within the muscle is not just one motor unit not just one nerve that innervates every single muscle fiber, right? So within the muscle itself, we have a number of motor units, and when you maximally contract your muscle, um, the motor units don't fire at the same time, right? Um, but of course, that's the objective. We want them to fire at the same time, like I mentioned about the tug of war. But we it's quite impossible for them to be firing so well, synchronizing. So there will be like this motor unit contracting, the other motor unit is relaxing a little bit. So there is a milliseconds of difference in the contraction speed. And probably because of that, that's why we tend to shake. All right. Relax, contract, and then there's a bit of a vibration, trembling. So that is my hypothesis. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, I love that. It's one of those things I've used kind of that shaking response for a variety of different things. And
Mm,
like I mentioned before, in relation to assessments and how I can introduce new, movement patterns and variables into the same pattern and assess how the body responds. To me, I use shaking response from the muscular system as a, kind of screening tool that way. If I get
mm,
someone to kind of achieve a certain range of motion and all of a sudden it's like everything starts quaking uncontrollably, to me, that's the body trying to tell us, like, look, neurologically, we haven't quite figured out how to build stability in
yeah.
this position yet, in this range of motion that way. And then the other element too is, is there a load component to it or a time component to it, right? So, I might not need someone to, hold a wall sit 10 minutes, but maybe they
Mm,
hold it 10 seconds and all of a sudden that leg shake starts to kick in. So, what can I do to mitigate that? Is that more of a, volume thing from the duration of time, even though it was only 10 seconds, or was it a load thing? Do we not have the ability to generate force that we need to from there? And I think, and this is just my personal opinion, I don't have any kind of basis of this, but as you mentioned in relation to the fatiguing element, there's certainly a transitional effect of fiber types that we see as we increase the demand of the exercise, whether that's higher intensity, whether that's longer duration, fatiguing that way. And I think that as some of those smaller muscular fibers fatigue, and we see a transitional shift
mm,
to other muscular fibers, we kind of see this like fatiguing of fiber while initial firing of new fiber that could cause shaking. Again, I'm not 100% sure on it. The other theory I've thrown around is it some kind of internal battle between muscle spindles and Golgi tendon organs within the body that way? One is saying, hey, we need to change our muscular length, and the other is saying, we're actually good right here. We can exert more than enough force, and it kind of creates this internal battle between does the body move or not move? And I think this shaking is almost like the visual representation of the body trying to sort itself out and figure out does it move or not move.
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, well, some that's a good research topic for those who have the capability to do it.
Absolutely. I mean, the other thing too, like we talked about the tendon, and it's like, some of the tendinous research is very difficult to impossible to perform
Mm.
as well, from my understanding, correct?
Yep, yep. It requires specialized equipment. Of course, people who are because like a lot of studies they use ultrasound, and it's a very sensitive thing. If you just position the ultrasound probe 1 millimeter different from where you originally put, you get a different reading altogether. So, people who do all this, will have to be very precise, and accurate, with lots of experience in doing that. I personally do not have that expertise. And that's one of the reasons why you don't see me having research on all this stuff. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, there's a lot of different worlds that kind of live under this isometric umbrella that way. And I realized even though we've talked about it for about an hour, we've really
Mm,
only scratched the surface of this world of isometric exercise, isometric training, and the many benefits that it
mm,
has from an athletic performance standpoint, injury risk mitigation, and beyond that way. And I think the exciting part about it is we're still learning so much. We're
yep.
still we still have so much that we have yet to understand. And I think that's what makes the work of individuals such as yourself so essential is you're at the forefront, kind of, blazing the trail forward for the rest of us like myself to follow that way, man. This is a great conversation. Is there anything we missed or any other closing thoughts that you have in relation to our conversation around isometrics today?
Mm, I think in general we touch on quite a lot of the stuff. I say again, it's best to keep things simple and not get too complicated. Keep to the basic training principle when we prescribe uh isometric training or any other form of training. And we did mention about making sure athletes get sufficient recovery because we're training them to perform. We're not training them to be fatigued, all right? And we see a lot of research showing that training to failure doesn't really provide any added benefit. In contrast, it takes longer time for them to recover from training to failure, and that compromise their other training on the field and stuff like that, and further increase the risk of injury if athletes are fatigued. So just remember, as long as athletes are performing, working maximally at each repetition, um, and not uh, getting them to train to their exhausted and stuff like that. That shouldn't be the goal. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Danny, for people who want to find out more about you and the incredible work that you're doing in the field that way, where can they find you at online?
Instagram, Danny Lum 82. I'm on LinkedIn as well. And I'm on X as well. I do have a web page under constructed web page, theperformanceconcept.com. I do sell some training programs, and I do have a guidebook on combining isometric and plyometric training. So if those who are interested, they can get on to my website and take a look at it. Yeah.
That's awesome. We'll link to all of that in the description below, from Danny's social media contacts to Danny's website and book and beyond that way. That way, if you want to find out more, you can just click there. Danny, this was amazing. I really appreciate your time and the work that you're doing in the space that way. Thank you so much, man.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for inviting me.